Welcome, everyone. I am Prince Valuri, an engineer at LinkedIn, here to talk about how we at LinkedIn are trying to solve the problem of ownership of technical assets. I want to start by talking a little bit about LinkedIn, what we stand for, and very relevant for this topic, our scale. At LinkedIn, our vision is to create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce. The way we want to achieve it, our mission, is to connect the world's professionals to make them more productive and successful. Let's unpack that a little bit. Every member of the global workforce. As of earlier this year, over 1 billion of them use LinkedIn, forming over 13,000 connections every minute. And I can tell you that our members see more than 1.5 million feed updates every minute, or that there are over 18,000 of us working across the globe. But a much more interesting and personally satisfying stat for me is that 7 people are hired every minute on LinkedIn. This means that there are over 207 billion edges in our economic graph, a peak QPS of over 2.5 million, and about 45 trillion Kafka messages sent every day. And you bet there's a ton of technology behind all of this. At a very high level, we've got over 9,000 engineers making over 30,000 commits and topping 1 million deployments every month. All of this occurs in over 10,000 microservices that are hosted in about 15,000 repositories. But life would be very simple if that was all. This is just the tip of the iceberg. As you can probably imagine, there's a ton of infrastructure that powers this. As I mentioned earlier, there are Kafka topics. And of course, there are production databases. You get the idea. Millions, in fact, tens of millions of very critical assets. And we need to have ownership for all of them. But what really is ownership? At the core, ownership represents the responsibility for an asset. Responsibility for what? For its development, for its operations, strategy, compliance, and empathizing with all the managers out there, its resourcing. Above all, accountability is critical. Who do I call if a given service went down? Who is accountable for ensuring that a given data set is GDPR compliant? Who is doing the prioritization for the feature requests for a given system? You're probably thinking that it cannot all be the same person. And you're right. It goes outwards and upwards. Ownership cannot be restricted to names in a file. Not only does accountability go up the org chart, it expands to everyone who works on it. It's ultimately the people doing the work, for now at least. So, what makes ownership so hard? There are a couple of reasons for it. Companies grow, sometimes quite rapidly. And during this time, responsibilities can change hands very quickly. And inevitably, ownership can fall through the cracks. As soon as I say the letters A and I, I'm sure many of you think shifting priorities. It happens. Things come up. And a team's, organizations, or the company's priorities can change. Which means that people are suddenly focusing on something entirely different. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everything they used to work on is sunset or decommissioned. Talking about people, role changes are extremely common. People are 4 times more likely to change teams than leave the company at LinkedIn. This brings a very interesting challenge. When people leave the company, usernames no longer exist. So it is easier to clean up records. But when people are around but in different roles, the usernames are valid, but the ownership information is very inaccurate. And there's one more constant thing in our industry, reorgs. This one is even more trickier. A reshuffle of people and their responsibilities can extensively affect ownership. Therefore, having usernames in a file is just not sustainable. And let's take a look at technology. This is how most org hierarchies look like, barring some dotted line cases. Whenever you ask the question, who is your manager, the answer is hopefully not ambiguous. It's clean, it's directed, there are no cycles. Again, hopefully there are no cycles. But then when you look at technology, it is not uncommon for it to look something like this. There are dependencies all over the place. Zooming into any one of these will potentially reveal something similar within it. And while it's common for infrastructure to be lower in the stack overall, but there are different kinds of infrastructure, and they may have a web of dependencies among themselves as well. So what can we do about it? We define teams and their relationship to the org structure. We do this by assigning unique identifiers to teams, integrating personnel data, defining teams to org relationships, linking teams to their assets, and exposing APIs for it all. The ideal level of abstraction that we have come up with is we start with the team. On the left, let's look at all the inputs to the team. Well, it needs a directly responsible individual, or what we call a manager of responsibility. It gets all employee data from our HR systems, who all work here, who reports to who, the changes to the reporting structure, metadata about the team, broad stuff like goals and vision, and very specific things like which Jira project they use and other preferences. Hierarchy. Similar to people, teams have a hierarchy. It's directed, and acyclic. On the right, let's look at all things where team ownership is implied. Well, there's technical assets. The answer to the typical question, who owns this? We are also able to extend it to certain permissions which are implied by ownership. There's on-call rotations, code ownership, operational metrics like SLOs. In some cases, this can be directly deduced based on ownership of assets. Online and offline identities like headless users as well. Now, being a part of the Microsoft family, it won't be too hard to tell that there would be some internal confusion with the name teams, so we branded it as crews. A crew owns assets and people belong to a crew. And the underlying premise for this whole approach is that asset relationships are inherently more stable than people to asset relationships. Okay, so what are some of the benefits of crews? Well, obviously, there's ownership, but one true source for ownership records. And the best part is that it is the one place to manage ownership for all assets owned by a crew. But people, who we call members, are one of the cornerstones of this concept. It is very common to say, I'm the owner of something. And while that's true, what is really implied is that I am an owner of something because I'm a member of the crew that owns it. I can be in many different crews for many different purposes, and the crew is the context of the role I'm playing at any given moment. It is a little bit of a culture change, but we're making good progress. Flexibility. People are free to create crews, especially for cases like working groups or tiger teams, which are very common. We call them virtual crews. You can go ahead and create one and invite people to it, but given that crews need a hierarchy, you'll also need to place it in the overall crew hierarchy. This flexibility goes a long way to enable people and engineers to work in a way that works best for them. And finally, identities. We automatically create and update security groups based on crews and then grant specific permissions to its members. This way, all you really need to do is join a crew and get all the privileges and the responsibilities. Here's a screenshot of a crew that I created. It's a virtual crew. It's a virtual crew I created for myself. And you can see that instead of being isolated, it's connected to a parent crew. So we ensure there's organizational ownership of whatever this crew owns. I cannot just go and create a virtual crew in a separate org where I'm not a member. Let's talk about assets. These are the things that a crew owns. Asset providers play the key role here. They are the systems that manage the life cycle of assets. A crew owns assets, but before that, it must be provisioned. Some system must acknowledge the existence of the asset. A very simple example would be a database provider like MySQL. That system is responsible for provisioning the databases and managing their life cycle. These providers deeply integrate with crews to allow users to manage all of their assets in one place. Now, if you bring assets from all providers into one place, as a crew member, you still need to be able to make sense of it all. Asset groups allow users to organize their assets in their crew in whatever way works best for them. Asset relationships can be of varying degrees, some really strong while others only a weak reference. For now, we started looking at the stronger relationships. Similar to the directed acyclic graph of crews, similar DAGs can exist for assets. For instance, an application is written in a repo. If that repo goes away, the application needs some serious attention. And finally, asset ownership is binding. As long as crew owns an asset, it cannot be abandoned or deleted. Here's a screenshot of the assets page of a crew. We can see that this crew is pretty light on assets, 2 repos and 2 apps with some relationships between them. There is the asset group on top, where you can change the one you're viewing. You can perform various actions here, create and manage asset groups for this crew, move assets between asset groups, and very crucially, transfer assets to another crew if necessary. This also invokes a handshaking process, where the other crew must accept the transfer for it to complete. And then there are things that are common to both crews and assets. Tracking. All metrics and reporting can aggregate based on either of them. Metrics can also easily be rolled up on crews wherever necessary. Automation. In order to make sure that we're dealing with people mobility in place, we handle transitions seamlessly and automatically as much as possible. But also, we're able to reach out to folks when in doubt and ask questions to the people involved. Ease of use. Nobody has a lot of time to fight with yet another tool. Seamless user experience for operations like transfers really helps people act fast and helps us keep the data quality high. And finally, compliance. Security and compliance is baked right in with processes like membership access reviews, handshakes for membership change, and default permission setup. So, how's it going? So far, we've been able to onboard over 100,000 assets. More than 10,000 have been transferred between crews. We've been able to save engineering work worth over 15,000 tickets that would otherwise take at least a couple of minutes each. And we're making progress on all of these fronts every day. So this is great, but how can we push this further and extract even more value out of this? We realized that true business value is derived from what we call products. These are end-to-end solutions that are built to solve a business problem. These are systems that are often made up of many different assets, potentially from multiple teams or crews. This allows us to track development progress, operations, metrics, compliance, all at one common level of aggregation. Let's say Crew A owns a search index, Crew B owns a couple of data pipelines for it, and Crew C owns a member-facing search experience. Together, these assets would form the search product. And when there is an incident, it is much more common to say something like, search is not working. It could actually be any one of the 146 different services that could be misbehaving, but the impact is felt at the product level, which is search. We're just starting out with this, and so far it is looking very promising. It's actually pretty exciting being able to track incidents and SLOs and other metrics at the product level. So with that, let's talk about the risks. The first one, very obvious, get a buy-in. Something like this involves work from a bunch of teams and requires somewhat of a cultural shift. When doing something at this scale, it is very crucial to get commitment from key stakeholders. In our case, it was the senior leadership who cared about operational excellence and various teams and managers who not only bought into the idea, but were willing to contribute and execute. The second one, coverage. Early on, I talked about tens of millions of assets across the country. Ensuring everybody is aligned to onboard is very critical. And finally, the bane of every ownership initiative, data quality. Everything I talked about starts falling apart if there is no data quality. Of course, the ownership information for assets is critical, but equally critical is the inventory of assets. This requires strong incentives, clear boundaries of roles and responsibilities, and going back to the first point, buy-in from the users. So, some takeaways. Asset relationships are more stable than people-to-asset relationships. Little details make up the big picture. Even the smallest of assets should have an owner. Flexibility is key. People love a product when it allows them to work in a way that works for them. And once people realize the benefits and potential, they will be highly incentivized to maintain hygiene. And of course, people are mobile. More mobile than you think. With that, thank you so much, and I hope you all enjoyed the talk.